For centuries, Muslims have been claiming that, according to the Quran, the Torah and the Gospel have been corrupted. More recently, Christians have been responding to this charge by quoting the Quran and showing that it never once criticizes the text of the Jewish and Christian scriptures. On the contrary, the Quran affirms the inspiration, preservation, and authority of the Torah and the Gospel. But our Muslim friends just don't see it. They call us liars. They say we're distorting what the Quran says. So what's going on here? How are Christians and Muslims looking at the exact same Quran, a Quran that repeatedly claims to be perfectly clear, and coming to completely different conclusions about what it says? And, even more importantly, how can we decide who's right? Well, fortunately for us, we've got some tools derived from Bayes' theorem that can help us get to the bottom of this, but not in the zut sense. Welcome to the Bayesian Islamic dilemma. In this video, we'll go through some basic principles of Bayesian reasoning. If this is new to you, don't worry, it's not very complicated. Then we'll apply these principles to what Muslims and Christians are claiming about the Quran. And finally, we'll see why we're looking at the same evidence but coming to radically different conclusions. Let's get started. Guess what? You use Bayesian reasoning all the time. You just don't realize it. Bayes' theorem is a formula for updating your thinking as new evidence comes in. Again, you do this all the time. Suppose it's 10 p.m. and I want to tell my wife something, but I don't want to wake her up if she's already asleep. She normally goes to bed between 9:30 and 10:30, so if it's 10 o'clock, let's say there's a 50-50 chance that she's already asleep. The probability that she's asleep is 50%, or 0.5, and the probability that she's awake is 50%, or 0.5. But then I stumble upon some evidence. I walk by our bedroom door, and I can tell from the light escaping from the bottom of the door that the lights are still on in our room. Now, it's possible that she fell asleep with the lights on, but she generally turns off the lights when she goes to bed. So, the evidence, namely, that the lights are on, makes way more sense if she's awake than if she's asleep. I conclude, therefore, that she's probably still awake. Notice what just happened. There were two hypotheses. Hypothesis 1, my wife is still awake. Hypothesis 2, my wife is asleep. These two hypotheses initially seemed equally probable, so I would have assigned each hypothesis a probability of 50% or 0.5. But some new evidence came in, the lights being on, and this evidence massively favored one hypothesis over the other, so much so that I became something like 99% sure she was still awake. How did I update my confidence in the hypothesis that my wife was still awake? I applied Bayes' theorem. More specifically, I applied what's called the odds form of Bayes' theorem, which, here again, you do all the time. We normally think of odds in gambling. This team is a 2-to-1 favorite. That horse is a 10-to-1 underdog. You can update gambling odds based on new evidence the same way you update the probability of a hypothesis being true. If a horse named Ney's theorem is a 10-to-1 underdog, but you suddenly find out that the fastest horse in the race is sick, that will change the odds of Ney's theorem winning. The odds form of Bayes' theorem is especially helpful when we're trying to figure out how some piece of evidence favors one hypothesis over another. Here's a simple version of the odds form of Bayes' theorem. This just says that we get the new odds by multiplying the prior odds by the likelihood ratio. That sounds fancy. It isn't. We already did it with no trouble at all. If hypothesis 1 is my wife is still awake, and hypothesis 2 is my wife is asleep, and E is the evidence that the bedroom lights are on, we see that the prior odds, the odds before we factored in the evidence, were 1-to-1. They were even. The likelihood is how likely the evidence is, or how much the evidence would be expected if the hypothesis is true. So we read this as the probability of the evidence given hypothesis 1, or the probability of the evidence assuming hypothesis 1 is true. Using our example, this would be the probability that the lights are on, assuming my wife is still awake. And this would be the probability that the lights are on, assuming my wife is asleep. Since the likelihood on top is much higher than the likelihood on bottom, the evidence is going to strongly favor hypothesis 1 over hypothesis 2, even though we started with the odds being even. So, the impact of the evidence is that the odds are now heavily in favor of hypothesis 1. The odds were 1 to 1, but the evidence makes far more sense given the truth of hypothesis 1. We don't even need actual numbers to say that based on the evidence, hypothesis 1 is probably true and hypothesis 2 is probably false. Good so far? Awesome. Now, we can simplify this even more because all we're comparing are, on the one hand, the prior probabilities, the probabilities before we factor in the evidence, and, on the other hand, how likely the evidence is on each hypothesis. So, we can rewrite the argument for my wife being awake like this. Hypothesis 1, my wife is still awake. Hypothesis 2, my wife is asleep. Evidence E, the bedroom lights are on. Premise 1, the prior probability of hypothesis 2 is not much greater than the prior probability of hypothesis 1. Premise 2, the probability of the evidence is much greater on hypothesis 1 than it is on hypothesis 2. This is just another way of saying that the evidence strongly favors hypothesis 1 over hypothesis 2. Conclusion, my wife is very probably awake. We say very probably because it's something like 99% probable. Now, for premise 1, why did I write this as the prior probability of hypothesis 2 is not much greater than the prior probability of hypothesis 1? We said that before we factored in the evidence, the odds were pretty much even, 50-50. So why write it like this? Well, because it's all we need. The evidence strongly favors hypothesis 1 over hypothesis 2. But if the prior probability of hypothesis 2 were much greater than the prior probability of hypothesis 1, the evidence might not do much. To go back to our example, suppose the prior probability of hypothesis 1 were much, much lower. Suppose I already knew that my wife took a bunch of Ambien at 9 p.m. and that this would almost certainly make her fall asleep by 10 p.m. The prior probability of the hypothesis that she was asleep at 10 p.m. would be much higher than the prior probability that she was awake at 10 p.m. Then, when I bring in the new evidence, the lights are on, I might still think it's more probable that she's asleep. On Ambien, she could have fallen asleep even with the lights on. So, if we're going to say that some piece of evidence shows that a hypothesis is probably true, it helps to know that the prior probability of an alternative hypothesis wasn't already much greater. And now we have all the tools we need for a simple Bayesian version of the Islamic dilemma. Consider two hypotheses. First hypothesis. The Quran confirms the inspiration, preservation, and authority of the Torah and the Gospel in the possession of Jews and Christians. We'll call this the confirmation hypothesis. Second hypothesis. The Quran claims that the Torah and the Gospel in the possession of Jews and Christians have been corrupted. We'll call this the Dawah hypothesis. To avoid any potential bias, let's pretend that we have no clue what the Quran says about the previous scriptures. Our minds are completely open. Maybe Muhammad said the previous scriptures were corrupted, maybe he didn't. We don't know yet. And, for the sake of argument, to keep things simple, let's assume that these are the only two hypotheses. There are other possibilities. For instance, the Quran could say nothing about the previous scriptures. The Quran could say that there were no inspired scriptures before Muhammad, and so on. But to keep this simple, we'll assume that the Dawah hypothesis and the confirmation hypothesis are the only options. Before we open the Quran to see what it says, the Dawah hypothesis and the confirmation hypothesis are both entirely plausible. A man who comes along in the 7th century and claims to be a prophet could say that the previous scriptures were corrupted, or he could say that the previous scriptures weren't corrupted. Prior to looking at what the Quran says, I don't see any reason to favor one hypothesis over the other. So, we can say that the prior probabilities are pretty even, but we'll go with the even more modest premise. The prior probability of the Dawah hypothesis isn't much greater than the prior probability of the confirmation hypothesis. Now, what's our evidence going to be? Ideally, we would include everything the Quran says about the previous scriptures, but this video would end up being several hours long. So, let's focus on 7 verses. Surah 7, verse 157. Those who follow the messenger, the unlettered prophet, whom they find inscribed in the Torah and the gospel that are with them, it is they who shall prosper. This verse is about Jews and Christians who find Muhammad inscribed in the Torah and the gospel that are with them. In Surah 2, verse 85, Allah is criticizing the Jews for following parts of the Torah and not following other parts of the Torah. Allah condemns them for this, and He says, "Do you then believe in part of the book and disbelieve in part? And what is the recompense of those who do so but disgrace in the life of this world? And on the day of resurrection, they shall be consigned to the most severe punishment." In Surah 4, verse 47, Allah says to the people of the book, "O you unto whom the book has been given, believe in what we have sent down," the Quran, "confirming that which is with you, before we blot out faces and turn them backwards, or curse them as we cursed those who broke the Sabbath. And the command of God shall be fulfilled." The Quran confirms the book that is still with the people of the book, Jews and Christians. In Surah 5, verse 43, some Jews come to Muhammad to settle a dispute. Allah responds, "Why do they come to you for judgment, O Muhammad, when they have the Torah before them, wherein is the judgment of Allah? Yet they turn back after that, and these are not the believers." According to the Quran, Jews don't need the Quran because they have the Torah. In Surah 5, verse 47, Allah commands Christians, "Let the people of the gospel judge by what Allah hath revealed therein. If any do fail to judge by the light of what Allah hath revealed, they are no better than those who rebel." According to the Quran, Christians are supposed to judge by the gospel, not by the Quran. If the Torah and the gospel have been corrupted, Jews and Christians have nowhere else to turn. Because in Surah 5, verse 68, Allah tells Muhammad to say, "O people of the book, you have no ground to stand upon unless you stand fast by the Torah, the gospel, and all the revelation that has come to you from your Lord." Interestingly, the Torah and the gospel were authoritative even for Muhammad. In Surah 10, verse 94, Allah says, "But if you, Muhammad, are in doubt as to what we have revealed to you, ask those who read the book before you. Certainly the truth has come to you from your Lord, therefore you should not be of the disputers." So, if Muhammad has doubts about his revelations, he can simply go to the people of the book to make sure his revelations line up with our revelations. Putting just these 7 verses together, the Quran claims that it's affirming scriptures that are with Jews and Christians. It claims that these scriptures are written down. It says we have to believe in all of our book, not just parts. It claims that Jews and Christians must judge by these scriptures. It claims that Jews and Christians have no other ground to stand upon apart from these scriptures. And it claims that these scriptures are authoritative even for Muhammad. Back to our 2 hypotheses. According to the confirmation hypothesis, The Quran confirms the inspiration, preservation, and authority of the Torah and the Gospel in the possession of Jews and Christians. According to the Dawa hypothesis, the Quran claims that the Torah and the Gospel in the possession of Jews and Christians have been corrupted. Clearly, the 7 Quran verses we read fit the confirmation hypothesis perfectly. These verses say exactly what we would expect the Quran to say if the confirmation hypothesis is true. But they make no sense whatsoever if the Dawa hypothesis is true. If the Dawa hypothesis is true, it makes absolutely no sense for the Quran to say it's affirming the scriptures that are with Jews and Christians and written down with Jews and Christians. It makes no sense for Allah to say we have to believe in all of our book and not just in parts of our book. It makes no sense for the Quran to order Jews and Christians to judge by corrupt scriptures. It makes no sense for the Quran to say that Jews and Christians have no other ground to stand upon apart from these scriptures. And it makes no sense for the Quran to say that Muhammad can only confirm his revelations by going to people who are reading corrupt scriptures. What does this mean? It means that the evidence massively favors the confirmation hypothesis over the Dawa hypothesis. We write this as the probability of the evidence given the confirmation hypothesis is much greater than the probability of the evidence given the Dawa hypothesis. That's another way of saying that the evidence strongly favors the confirmation hypothesis over the Dawa hypothesis. The conclusion we would draw is, other evidence held equal, the confirmation hypothesis is much more probable than the Dawa hypothesis. Notice I included the phrase, other evidence held equal, because we're granting the possibility that our Muslim friends could conceivably offer some powerful evidence that we've overlooked, powerful evidence that would change our minds and convince us that the Dawa hypothesis is probably the correct position. But we keep listening to their responses, and we're not seeing anything that even remotely supports the Dawa hypothesis. All the other evidence that we haven't included in this video simply offers more support for the confirmation hypothesis. So, my version of the Bayesian Islamic dilemma runs as follows. We have 2 hypotheses. One, the confirmation hypothesis. The Quran confirms the inspiration, preservation, and authority of the Torah and the Gospel in the possession of Jews and Christians. And 2, the Dawa hypothesis. The Quran claims that the Torah and the Gospel in the possession of Jews and Christians have been corrupted. Our evidence is 7 Quran verses. Premise 1, the prior probability of the Dawa hypothesis isn't much greater than the prior probability of the confirmation hypothesis. Premise 2, the evidence strongly favors the confirmation hypothesis over the Dawa hypothesis. Conclusion, other evidence held equal, the confirmation hypothesis is much more probable than the Dawa hypothesis. If our Muslim friends don't come up with some overriding evidence, we'll simply conclude that the confirmation hypothesis is very probably true. And to make this a proper Islamic dilemma, we can add, the Quran contradicts the Torah and the Gospel on fundamental doctrines, therefore Islam is very probably false. I should go ahead and point out here that this isn't some new argument. Just as you use Bayesian reasoning all the time without realizing it, if you've been using the Islamic dilemma, you've been using Bayesian reasoning without realizing it. We have our hypothesis, Muslims have their hypothesis. We look at what the Quran says, and it massively favors our hypothesis over their hypothesis. We give our Muslim friends every opportunity to present evidence that outweighs our evidence, and they never come close. So we have every reason to conclude that our hypothesis is the correct one. This raises an obvious question that I brought up at the beginning of this video. If Christians and Muslims are looking at the same verses in the same book, why are we coming to completely different conclusions? Well, that takes us back to Bayes. Remember, as one of our premises, I said that the prior probability of the Dawa hypothesis isn't much greater than the prior probability of the confirmation hypothesis. In other words, before we actually examine the evidence, we don't have a reason to strongly favor one hypothesis over the other. So we turn to the evidence with open minds and realize, wow, this evidence massively supports the hypothesis that the Quran confirms the inspiration, preservation, and authority of the Torah and the Gospel. We don't see any evidence that suggests otherwise. Therefore, we conclude that the Quran very probably confirms the inspiration, preservation, and authority of the Torah and the Gospel. Since the Torah and the Gospel contradict the Quran on fundamental doctrines, the Quran is very probably wrong. But our Muslim friends don't approach the evidence this way. They reject the first premise. Why? Because they've been told all their lives that the Quran says the Torah and the Gospel have been corrupted. And they've been trained all their lives not to question what they hear from their sheikhs and imams and da'is. So they've already decided that the probability of the Dawah hypothesis is 1. It's 100% true. And since they've already decided that the Dawah hypothesis is 100% true and that they can't question this hypothesis, no amount of evidence can convince them otherwise. So when we point out that Allah says He's confirming the scriptures we have and that we have to judge by our scriptures, our Muslim friends are already convinced that Allah can't possibly mean what He says. He must mean something completely different from what He says in the Quran. This means that for our Muslim friends, at least for most of them, the evidence is completely irrelevant. We're going where the evidence points. They're going with what they've been told, even though it completely contradicts the evidence. Now, I presented my Bayesian Islamic dilemma without bringing in any sophisticated math. If you'd like to see a Bayesian Islamic dilemma with some number crunching, be sure to watch Than's argument over at Inspiring Philosophy. The link is in the description box.